He didn't flinch. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed if anyone had been paying attention to the right person. Malcolm Hayes stood completely still at the center of the ballroom, while the laughter moved through the room like a wave, and he did not move, did not blink, did not give Richard Whitmore the satisfaction of a single visible reaction. The chandeliers threw gold light across 200 faces. Most of them were smiling. A few were uncomfortable but quiet about it, which was its own kind of answer. Richard Whitmore pointed one finger at Malcolm, and said it again louder this time for the people at the back tables who might have missed it the first time. Someone called the front desk. The tech guy wandering around is making our guests uncomfortable. Malcolm stood there and let it land. Then he breathed once slowly, the way a man breathes when he has decided not to give the world what it is asking for. 90 minutes earlier, Malcolm had been standing in his apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, staring at an email on his phone with the particular look of a man who has just been told something he cannot refuse. The subject line read, NASA Futures Gala Mandatory Attendance Black Tie No Exceptions. He had read it 3 times. Not because it was confusing, because he was trying to decide how he felt about it, and that was taking longer than usual. Malcolm owned one dark suit. He had bought it 6 years ago for a funeral, and worn it twice since then. Once to a congressional briefing he had not been allowed to speak at, and once to his colleague's retirement dinner, where the wrong man had been called a pioneer 3 separate times, while Malcolm sat at the back of the room eating cold salmon. He changed his shirt twice before giving up on the second one and going back to the first. He clipped his father's silver watch onto his left wrist, the way he always did when he needed to remember something important about who he was and where he came from, and he took the metro into the city. The annual NASA Futures Gala was held every November at a venue in downtown Washington that cost more per night than Malcolm's monthly rent. This particular year, it had been moved to a private event space off the National Mall, the kind of building where the walls themselves seemed to carry the understanding that certain people were expected here and certain people were not. The gala raised money officially. It networked, really. It placed the right names in the same room as the right checkbooks and let everything else happen naturally. Senators attended. Defense contractors sent their senior vice presidents. Journalists came looking for quotes and stayed for the open bar. Billionaire aerospace donors arrived in cars with drivers and left with government access that no procurement process would ever fully account for. Malcolm arrived by metro and walked 4 blocks in the cold. At the entrance, a security checkpoint had been set up outside the main doors. Malcolm joined the line. He had his NASA identification badge in his jacket pocket, the real one, not the gala wristband, because someone had failed to include him on the advance list, and the wristband had never arrived. Frank Donnelly was running the door. He was a heavyset man with a careful face, the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal very little, and he looked at Malcolm the way he probably looked at everyone, which was with the specific patience of a man deciding whether a problem was going to be simple or complicated. Malcolm said his name, gave his employee number, showed his badge. Donnelly looked at the list, looked at Malcolm, looked back at the list. While this was happening, a black Bentley pulled up to the curb behind Malcolm. A man in his 60s climbed out silver-haired tuxedo, fitted the way only genuinely expensive tuxedos are fitted, and Frank Donnelly looked up from Malcolm's badge and waved the man through with a nod and something close to a smile. The man did not stop, did not show identification, did not give his name. Malcolm watched this happen. He said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that saying something in these moments cost more than it was worth, and the account was already overdrawn. Donnelly eventually found Malcolm's name not on the primary list, but on a secondary sheet that had been faxed over that afternoon, which was apparently how NASA had handled the situation, and Malcolm walked inside. The ballroom was extraordinary in the way that rooms built to impress powerful people always are. High ceilings, long tables set with white linen and crystal. The kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they belong there, which was Malcolm understood the entire point. He had been inside for 4 minutes when he found Dr. Evelyn Brooks standing near the far window, holding a glass of sparkling water she had not touched, watching the room the way Malcolm watched it, which was carefully and with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that rooms like this one are never quite what they appear to be. She was the NASA mission director. She had a PhD in aerospace systems and a second graduate degree in organizational management, and she had fought for every inch of the position she held in ways that most of her colleagues would never fully understand, because most of them had never needed to fight the same fights. She was also the only person in the building who knew exactly what Malcolm had built. She saw him cross the room toward her, and something in her expression shifted very slightly, the way a person's face shifts when they have been waiting for something and are relieved it has finally arrived, but are also immediately aware that the relief is going to be short-lived. He stopped beside her. They stood together for a moment, looking out at the room. She said quietly, "Stay close to the program table tonight." He asked why. She looked away. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore was laughing at something Senator Pierce had said, the kind of laugh that was less about what was funny and more about what was being established. He was 61 years old and worth $4 billion, and he had recently described himself in a Forbes interview as the private sector conscience of American space exploration, which was a sentence that had taken Malcolm several minutes to finish reading. Richard's daughter Claire was filming him on her phone from 2 tables away, already narrating to the 1,400 people watching her feed about the incredible energy in the room tonight and the absolute insanity of getting to be at a gala like this. Richard Whitmore's eyes moved across the room in the slow, deliberate way of a man who has never been in a space he did not feel entitled to own. His gaze passed over Malcolm without stopping. Malcolm turned back to Dr. Brooks, but she had already moved toward the program table, leaving him with a half-answered question and the quiet, familiar weight of a room that did not know what it was standing next to. The projection screen near the east wall had been cycling through mission data for the better part of an hour, and most people in the room had looked at it the way people look at wallpaper, which is to say they had not looked at it at all. Malcolm had been looking at it for 6 minutes. He was standing near the bar, with his back to the room, not because he was hiding, but because something in the third panel of the display had stopped making sense to him approximately 6 minutes ago, and he had not been able to look away since. The numbers were slightly off. Not catastrophically. Not in a way that anyone without 3 years of intimate knowledge of that particular system would have noticed. But Malcolm noticed the way a composer notices when a single instrument in a full orchestra is a quarter step flat, and the feeling it produced in him was not panic, but focus, a quiet narrowing of attention that had gotten him through every crisis in his professional life. He was still working through it in his head when someone tapped him on the shoulder. Not a tap exactly, more of a knock. The kind of physical contact that contains a message about power delivered by a man who had never once considered that the person he was touching might not be who he assumed. Malcolm turned around. Richard Whitmore was standing 18 inches away, empty glass in hand, with the expression of a man who has been waiting longer than he considers acceptable, and has decided that the appropriate response is to make that someone else's problem. He said he had been waiting 10 minutes. He said Scotch neat. He said the screen behind the podium had been glitching since they sat down, and someone needed to do something about it. Malcolm looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Malcolm, just that." His first name offered the way you offer something to a person and watch to see what they do with it. Whitmore stared at him. He said he did not care what his name was. He said he cared about his drink. Malcolm did not move. He did not correct the assumption. He did not reach into his jacket pocket for the badge that would have ended the entire exchange in under 10 seconds. He stood there and held the weight of the moment with the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision, even if the room around him had not yet understood what that decision was. At a nearby table, 2 guests had turned to watch. The way people turn when they sense that something uncomfortable is happening and have not yet committed to looking away. Claire Whitmore raised her phone. The small red light in the upper corner of her screen blinked on. A younger man in his early 30s appeared at Richard's elbow. Hand extended the smooth entrance of someone who had been working his way across the room all evening. Richard shook his hand, without taking his eyes completely off Malcolm, and then, as if Malcolm were simply part of the scenery he was commenting on, gestured in his direction and said that NASA's technical staff was really something lately. The tone was not cruel in the way that cruelty announces itself. It was worse than that. It was casual. It was the tone of a man describing a minor inconvenience, a broken elevator, a slow internet connection, something unfortunate, but ultimately beneath serious consideration. The younger man smiled politely and said nothing, which was its own kind of participation. Malcolm looked across the room. Dr. Evelyn Brooks was standing near the program table. She had seen it. He knew she had seen it because she was looking directly at him with an expression that cost her something to maintain, and she gave the smallest possible movement of her head so small it was barely a gesture at all. Not now. Malcolm understood. He had spent enough time inside government institutions to know the architecture of a situation where someone's hands were tied, where the rules of a classified protocol could reach all the way across a ballroom and hold a person in place even when every instinct they had was pulling them in the opposite direction. Evelyn Brooks was not abandoning him. She was trapped inside the same system that had built everything Malcolm had built, and some of its walls were invisible until you walked into them, too. He looked back at Whitmore, who had already turned away, resuming his conversation with the younger donor, as if the matter were settled, as if Malcolm were already gone. In the far corner near the coat check, a 19-year-old named Isaiah Turner had not moved in 2 minutes. Isaiah was a NASA internship finalist from Howard University. He was the kind of young man who carried a notebook everywhere and had read every published paper Malcolm Hayes had ever authored, which was not a widely known list because most of Malcolm's significant work existed inside documents that required security clearance to access. Isaiah had found the public-facing research and built a private archive of it, and had written in his application essay that Malcolm Hayes was proof that the field had space for people who looked like him, which was the kind of sentence that a 19-year-old writes with complete sincerity, and which turns out to be either the truest or the cruelest thing in the room, depending on the night. This was not a good night for that sentence. Isaiah stood frozen in his corner and watched the man he had studied for 2 years get waved away from a bar by a security guard. Frank Donnelly had appeared at Malcolm's side with the careful professionalism of a man doing his job, which was at that moment to politely ask Malcolm to move away from the bar service area, as it was reserved for event staff. Donnelly was following instructions. He did not know. There was no reason he would have known. But the optics of what had just happened, a black man in a plain dark suit being turned away from a bar, at the instruction of a white security guard, while a silver-haired billionaire watched from 10 feet away, were the kind of optics that do not require explanation to land. Claire had titled the stream by now, "Rich People Gala Problems LOL, 400 viewers." Malcolm pocketed his hands. He breathed once the way his mother had taught him to breathe when the world was doing the thing it sometimes does, slowly through the nose, until the heat behind the eyes receded, and what was left was something colder and more useful. He thought about what Gloria Hayes had told him the night before he left for MIT, standing in the kitchen of their house in Southeast D.C., with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she had been drinking cold for an hour, because she had not had time to let it cool properly. She had said the ones who make it don't make noise. They make history. Malcolm moved to the back of the room. He found a spot near the rear wall where the light was lower and the crowd was thin, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the projection screen that was still cycling through data he had spent 3 years of his life building. And he let the room continue, not knowing what it was standing next to. There was a door at the far end of the ballroom that opened onto a narrow terrace overlooking the mall, and Malcolm found it the way he had always found exits in rooms like this one, not by looking for them, but by needing them enough that his feet simply moved in the right direction. The air outside was cold and clean, and carried the distant sound of traffic from Constitution Avenue. The Washington Monument stood white and still against the November sky. Malcolm leaned against the stone railing and looked at it for a moment, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the cold work on the heat that had been building behind his sternum for the last 40 minutes. Then he took out his phone and typed 3 words to the only person he ever sent 3 words to when the night had gone this way. It happened again. He did not have to explain what it meant. Gloria Hayes had been receiving versions of this message for 20 years, since the first time Malcolm had called her from a payphone outside a graduate seminar at MIT because he had not yet owned a cell phone, and he had needed to hear her voice before he could go back inside and finish the class. She called in 40 seconds. He answered, and said nothing at first, just held the phone against his ear and listened to her breathe, which was its own kind of language between them. Gloria said his name once, the way she always said it, not as a question but as a confirmation. I see you, I know where you are not alone in this. Malcolm said he was fine. She did not argue with that. Gloria Hayes had raised a son who said he was fine, the way other people said good morning, reflexively, as a kind of greeting to the world. And she had long ago learned that the word fine from Malcolm meant something closer to I am still standing, which was actually the more important information. She asked if he was still there. He said yes. She said, then you haven't lost yet. They stayed on the line for another minute without saying much. Malcolm looked out at the city. Gloria was probably in her kitchen in Southeast D.C., probably still in her reading glasses, probably with the television on low in the background, the way she always kept it, not for the noise, but for the company. She had worked 31 years as a public school math teacher and had taken on tutoring jobs on weekends and substitute shifts in the summers to keep Malcolm in the kind of programs that gave him access to the kind of future she believed he was owed. She had never once described any of it as sacrifice. That was the word other people used when they talked about her. She just called it Tuesday. Malcolm said goodnight. She told him to eat something. He said he would. Neither of them believed it. He stood on the terrace for another few minutes after he hung up, and the cold helped the way cold always helps, when what you are carrying is the particular kind of weight that has no name in polite company. He had been here before. Not on this terrace, not in this city, but in this exact interior landscape, this specific coordinates of invisible and responsible at the same time. He had been 23 years old, sitting in a propulsion seminar at MIT, in a room where he was the only black student, and he had turned in a paper that had taken him 4 days to write, not because it was difficult, but because he had rewritten the opening paragraph 11 times, trying to calibrate the tone, trying to find the register that was confident without being perceived as aggressive, rigorous, without being perceived as showing off authoritative, without making the professor uncomfortable with how much he knew. The paper had come back with a single word written across the top in red pen. Promising. And then below it in pencil, as if it were an afterthought, as if it had simply slipped out for your background. Malcolm had stared at those 3 words for a long time. He had not said anything to the professor. He had folded the paper in half and put it in his bag and walked to his next class and gotten a perfect score on the midterm 2 weeks later, and never mentioned it to anyone for 7 years until he told Gloria one Sunday afternoon, and she had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "Baby, they always do that. The question is what you do next." These were the kinds of life stories that did not end up in the press release. The ones that happened in seminar rooms and on the phone in the parking lot and in the margins of papers that showed the whole of a person's ability and received a single word in response. These were the black stories that the institution collected and processed and filed away, and the people who lived them just kept going, because what else do you do? Because the work was still real, even when the recognition was not. The 18 months came back to him the way it always did when he was standing in the cold, trying to remember why any of it was worth it. 18 months during which Malcolm's autonomous navigation system for the Mars mission had failed 12 times in simulation. 12 separate catastrophic failures, each one requiring a complete redesign of one or more core subsystems. He had slept in the lab on a cot he had brought from home. He had eaten vending machine food and drunk bad coffee, and argued with his own code at 2 a.m. like a man having a conversation with something he both loved and could not forgive. Nobody outside the team had known. The project was classified at a level that meant most of NASA did not know it existed. There were no profiles written, no features published, no names attached to the work in any public-facing document. The internal project log had a single line that had stayed with Malcolm longer than any award or commendation he had ever received. Lead architect, M. Hayes, status mission critical. Mission critical. He had printed that line and taped it to the wall above his cot, and looked at it every morning when he woke up on the floor of a government laboratory, and it had been enough. Inside the ballroom, it was not enough for 400 people watching a live stream. Claire Whitmore's viewer count had climbed, while Malcolm stood in the cold, moved by the specific mathematics of social media outrage, which operates on its own timeline and answers to no one. 3,200 viewers now, and the comment section had shifted in tone the way comment sections shift when the crowd begins to sense that the joke is not what it appeared to be. Someone had typed, "Why is security moving him, though?" Someone else had typed, "He's clearly not staff. Look at how he's standing." A third comment, posted and immediately buried under responses, had asked simply, "Who is this guy?" The clip was already moving. Someone had screenshotted a frame and posted it to Twitter with no caption at all, just the image Malcolm at the back of the room, hands in pockets, watching a projection screen full of data, while 200 people in evening wear laughed at something Richard Whitmore had said. The image had something in it that was hard to name, but easy to feel, and feelings on the internet travel faster than explanations. Isaiah Turner had not gone back to his corner. He had found Dr. Evelyn Brooks near the program table, and he had come to stand beside her with the barely controlled energy of a person who has been holding something in for as long as they can manage, and is approaching the end of that capacity. He was 19 years old, and he had come to this city on a scholarship and a dream that was built in significant part on the existence of men like Malcolm Hayes. And what he had just watched happen in this ballroom had done something to the internal architecture of that dream that he was not yet ready to name. He asked her why no one was saying anything. His voice was quiet but not steady. He asked why she wasn't saying something. Evelyn Brooks looked at him with an expression that Malcolm, if he had been standing there, would have recognized immediately, because it was the same expression she had given him at the window an hour ago, the expression of a person who is not free to do what they know is right, not because they do not know what right looks like, but because the institution they serve has built walls around that knowledge and called the walls protocol. She did not answer Isaiah's question. He stared at her for a moment, long enough to understand that the answer was not coming, and then he turned and walked back across the ballroom. He did not pull out his phone to go live. He did not post anything. He did not caption, comment, or share. He opened his phone, found the clip that was already circulating and saved it to his camera roll without any file name at all. Then he stood in his corner and watched the room, and waited the way people wait when they have decided to be patient about something that is going to matter later. Malcolm came back inside when the cold had done what cold can do, which is not fix anything, but make the unfixed things easier to carry for a while. The ballroom had shifted in his absence. The seated dinner portion of the evening was winding down waitstaff, moving quietly between tables, collecting plates, and the energy in the room had consolidated toward the front, toward the low stage, and the podium where the evening's formal program was about to begin. Malcolm found his spot near the rear wall again, and stood there with his hands at his sides, watching. Richard Whitmore took the podium at 9:47. He did it the way he did everything, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged there. He adjusted the microphone with one hand, smiled at the front tables, and waited for the applause to settle with the patience of someone who has learned that silence properly held is its own form of authority. He began by thanking the room. He thanked the senator. He thanked NASA's leadership, which was a category he gestured toward, broadly, without naming anyone specifically the way you gesture at infrastructure you find useful, but have never particularly thought about. Then he began to talk about the future. He was a good speaker. Malcolm would give him that. He had the rhythm of someone who had spent years in rooms where the quality of your ideas mattered less than the confidence with which you delivered them, and he used that rhythm now, moving from the broad to the specific, from the inspirational to the technical building toward the centerpiece of his remarks, which was the Mars mission. He described it as a culmination. He described it as the natural endpoint of American ambition. He used the phrase pushing the boundary of human reach, which was the kind of phrase that sounds like it means something until you try to locate the meaning. Then he began talking about the navigation system. Malcolm went very still. Whitmore was using words from a briefing document. Malcolm could tell because the phrasing had the specific flatness of text that has been read and memorized without being understood the way a student can recite a formula without knowing what any of the variables represent. He said autonomous terrain mapping architecture. He said redundant fail-safe sequencing. He said real-time orbital correction protocol. He said all of it with total confidence, the confidence of a man who has never had to distinguish between knowing something and knowing the words for something. Malcolm had written those words. Not all of them. Some of them had been edited by the communications office, smoothed out for public consumption. But the architecture beneath the language, the actual system those phrases were attempting to describe, that was his. 3 years of his life, 12 failed simulations, 18 months on a cot in a lab that smelled like recycled air and burned coffee. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He opened a secure application that required a 12-character authentication code and a biometric confirmation, the kind of access that took 18 months of clearance review to obtain. A loading bar moved across the screen. Then the interface opened, and Malcolm was looking at a live telemetry feed from the surface of Mars. Numbers, coordinates, system status indicators, all green except one, which he noted and filed away for later. Atmospheric readings, navigation lock confirmation. The quiet, faithful pulse of a system doing exactly what it had been built to do 48 million miles from the room where a man who had never written a line of code was explaining it to 200 people who were nodding along. Malcolm was the only person in the ballroom with that access. He was in that moment the only person in the building. The side door near the coat check opened. Malcolm noticed it because he noticed most things, and because the man who came through it moved differently from everyone else in the room. He did not enter the way gala guests enter, which is to say, with the slight performance of arrival, the awareness of being seen. He came through the door the way someone comes through a door when they have been traveling for 7 hours and have one more thing to do before they can rest. Commander Daniel Reyes was 47 years old and had spent a cumulative 14 months in low Earth orbit across 3 separate missions, and he had the kind of posture that space gives you and gravity never quite takes back. He was carrying a travel bag that had not been checked still over one shoulder, and his formal attire was the attire of a man who had changed in an airport bathroom and was making no apologies for it. He scanned the room once. He found Malcolm in approximately 4 seconds, which was about how long it took anyone who actually knew Malcolm to find him in a crowd, because Malcolm was always at the back, and always still. Reyes crossed the room without stopping to greet anyone. He passed 2 senators, a deputy administrator, and Richard Whitmore's table without breaking stride. He reached Malcolm and extended his hand. Malcolm shook it. It was the handshake of people who have been through something real together, not a social gesture, but a recognition, the physical equivalent of a sentence that does not need to be finished, because both people already know how it ends. Reyes said quietly that he had flown in from Houston to be there when it went live. He said Malcolm should be up front. Malcolm said he was fine back here. Reyes looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has learned when not to argue. Then he said that the crew had checked in 2 hours ago. Navigation locked. All systems nominal. Malcolm said he knew. He said he had been monitoring. Reyes nodded once and turned to face the podium alongside Malcolm. Both of them standing at the back of a room full of people who were listening to a billionaire describe a system that the man beside them had built from a nothing, and neither of them said anything about it. At the podium, Whitmore concluded his prepared remarks and opened the floor to questions. A journalist in the 3rd row raised her hand. She was from a science publication. Malcolm could tell by the specific quality of her attention, the way she had been listening to Whitmore's technical claims, with a slight narrowing of focus that suggested she had noticed something was off, but had not yet located exactly where. She asked about the autonomous fail-safe protocol. She asked how it functioned in the event of total communication loss between the mission and Earth. Whitmore paused. He smiled. He gave an answer that was approximately 40% correct and structured in a way that made it very difficult to identify which 40% was real without already knowing the full system. He spoke about redundancy and about layered response architecture and about the remarkable engineering that NASA's teams had developed using the word teams, the way people use it when they are trying to convey credit, without attaching it to any specific person. Malcolm's jaw tightened, a movement so small that only someone watching closely would have caught it. Dr. Brooks, standing near the program table 20 feet away, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Reyes looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked at the floor. The journalist wrote something in her notebook and did not follow up, which was either because she was satisfied or because she was saving the question for somewhere else, somewhere with more time and fewer cameras. And Malcolm understood that either way, the answer she had just received was going to sit in her notes and eventually become something. His phone vibrated. Not a message. A priority alert, the kind that came with a specific haptic pattern. He had programmed himself precisely so he would never mistake it for anything else. He looked at the screen. The Mars mission had entered a communication blackout window, a 14-minute gap created by orbital alignment routine, expected logged in the mission schedule 3 weeks ago. But alongside the blackout notification was a secondary flag. He had not expected a small amber indicator in the terrain mapping subroutine 1 level below, critical, the kind of anomaly that could resolve on its own, or could, if left unaddressed for the duration of the blackout compound, into something that required a great deal more than 14 minutes to fix. Nobody in the room knew about it. Nobody in the room could know. Malcolm was already moving toward the terrace door phone in both hands, thumbs working across the screen with the focused speed of someone for whom this kind of problem is not a crisis, but a language. A familiar and demanding language that he has spent his entire adult life learning to speak fluently. He pushed through the door into the cold and the quiet, and behind him the ballroom continued its evening 200 people in their finest clothes, eating and drinking and talking about the future, while the man who had actually built part of it stood on a stone terrace in the November dark and held it together with his hands. The terrace door opened 4 minutes after Malcolm had stepped through it. He did not look up. He was deep in a sequence of diagnostic inputs moving through the terrain mapping subroutine with the focused efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this kind of intervention enough times that his hands know what to do before his mind has finished forming the instruction. The anomaly was small, but it was real, a miscalibration in the elevation reading algorithm that would have been invisible for approximately 11 more minutes before it began compounding against the orbital correction data, and he had maybe 6 minutes left in the blackout window to address it cleanly. He heard footsteps on the stone. He registered them and filed them away and kept typing. Richard Whitmore said he had specifically told security that personal devices were not permitted at the podium level. His voice had the particular edge of a man who is accustomed to his instructions being followed and has just discovered that someone has failed to follow one of them. He asked who Malcolm was with. Malcolm did not look up. His thumbs moved across the screen. A secondary parameter needed manual override. He entered the code. Behind Whitmore, the terrace door opened again. Daniel Reyes came through it without hurrying, which was the most authoritative thing about his entrance. The complete absence of urgency in his movement, the bearing of a man who has floated weightless above the earth, and knows in a way that is cellular and permanent the precise scale of what actually matters. Behind Reyes came 2 senior NASA engineers, whose names Malcolm knew, and whose presence here meant that someone inside had understood enough of what was happening to pull the right people toward the right door. Behind them at the threshold, Evelyn Brooks stood with one hand on the doorframe watching. This was no longer a quiet corner. Whitmore turned slightly, at the sound of footsteps registering the new arrivals, and something in his expression recalculated not quite uncertainty, yet but the first small shadow of it, the moment before a man who has never been wrong in a room begins to consider the possibility that the room has changed around him. He said again, louder, directed now at Reyes, because Reyes was clearly someone worth directing things at, that there were protocols about devices at this level of the event, and he wanted to know who had authorized this. Reyes looked at him. He did not answer the question. He let the silence sit for exactly long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Then he stepped forward past Whitmore and positioned himself so that he was standing slightly between Whitmore and Malcolm, not blocking, not aggressive, simply present, in a way that altered the geometry of the terrace and everyone's position within it. He spoke loud enough for the small crowd that had gathered at the doorway guests, who had followed the movement of important-looking people out of the ballroom the way people follow any sudden current in a still room, not knowing where it leads, but unwilling to be the one who stayed behind. He said Malcolm was not maintenance. He said Malcolm had built the system that was keeping their astronauts alive on Mars. He said that right now, in real time, Malcolm was fixing something that Whitmore would not understand, even if Malcolm took the time to explain it, which he did not currently have. The terrace went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something true has been said in them. Richard Whitmore's smile, the one that had been his constant companion all evening, the one that had moved through the ballroom like a weather system, confident and warm and entirely self-generated, disappeared. It did not transform into something else. It did not become anger or embarrassment or defiance. It simply stopped. The architecture of his face beneath it was less certain than anyone in that room had ever seen it, and the absence of the smile made him look for the first time all evening like a man his actual age. Inside the ballroom, something else was happening. Claire Whitmore had not ended her stream. She had not made that decision, possibly because she was not yet sure what decision to make. Possibly because 23 years of performing her life for an audience had made the act of stopping the camera feel more unnatural than continuing. She had turned the phone toward the terrace door when the crowd had moved that direction, following the motion instinctively, and her viewers had followed with her. 47,000 of them now. Someone had screenshotted a frame from earlier in the stream and posted it to X with a single line of text asking who the black man was that Richard Whitmore had just humiliated at the NASA gala. The post had been shared 400 times before the gala's own communications director had seen it. It had been shared 900 more times in the 11 minutes since. In the comments, something was resolving. A woman who worked in NASA's public affairs office had recognized Malcolm's face from an internal all-hands meeting 18 months ago, where he had presented a technical briefing that she had not fully understood but had not forgotten because of the way the room had gone very quiet when he spoke the quality of attention people pay to someone who knows something no one else in the room knows. She typed his name into the comment thread and immediately second-guessed herself and deleted it and then retyped it because the alternative was saying nothing, and she had already spent enough of this evening saying nothing. A science journalist who had written a profile 2 years ago on NASA's Propulsion Research Division, a profile that had been edited to remove most of the specific names for classification reasons, recognized the context, if not the face. She pulled her notes from that piece. She found the name. She did not post it. She opened a new document and began typing. The clip was moving faster than any coordinated response could address. The gala's PR firm had sent 2 emails and received no reply. The communications director was on the phone with a deputy administrator. The deputy administrator was looking for someone who could tell her exactly who Malcolm Hayes was and what he was authorized to disclose about himself, and the answer to that question was currently on a stone terrace in the November dark, 60 seconds from finishing what he had come out here to do. Malcolm entered the final sequence. He confirmed the override. He waited 3 seconds, which was the longest 3 seconds of the evening, longer than the moment at the bar. Longer than Whitmore's speech, longer than the call with his mother 3 seconds, in which the subroutine either corrected or it didn't, in which the system either held or it didn't, in which 48 million miles away, a navigation architecture either continued functioning as designed or began the slow cascade toward something that would require a great deal more than one man on a terrace to address. The anomaly flag cleared. System nominal. Malcolm exhaled once a single slow release of breath and lowered his phone and put it in his pocket. Then he turned around. The terrace held Reyes standing closest. Brooks at the door, her hand still on the frame. The 2 NASA engineers behind her. Frank Donnelly, who had come outside without quite knowing why, and was now standing near the railing with the expression of a man who is recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the last 2 hours. Senator Pierce had been pulled from his table by an aide and had arrived at the terrace doorway 30 seconds ago, and he was standing very still with the careful blankness of a politician who has not yet determined which way the wind is blowing but is paying very close attention. And Richard Whitmore. Whitmore was standing in the center of the terrace with his wine glass still in his hand, and his face had gone the color of ash, the specific gray of a man who has just understood all at once, and with no warning the full dimensions of what he has done and who he has done it to. Claire was still live. She had turned the phone toward her father because she did not know what else to point it at. The camera held his face in the cold November light, and the 47,000 people watching the stream saw what Malcolm saw when he turned around. A room that finally knew what it had been standing next to. Richard Whitmore laughed. It was a short sound, reflexive, the laugh of a man who has spent 6 decades using charm as a first response to every situation that threatened to become uncomfortable. And it arrived now with the slightly delayed timing of something that no longer fit the room but had nowhere else to go. He said it was clearly a misunderstanding. He said it in the tone of a man who is accustomed to the word misunderstanding, functioning as a door that closes things, a polite mechanism for moving a room from difficulty back toward comfort. And he looked around the terrace with the beginning of his smile, already reassembling itself, reaching for the familiar instrument. Reyes did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing and looked at Whitmore with the patient, unemotional attention of someone who has spent significant portions of his career in environments where the consequences of imprecision are not social but physical, and who has therefore developed a very high tolerance for people who are uncomfortable and a very low tolerance for people who are trying to manage their way out of something they actually did. Dr. Evelyn Brooks stepped forward from the doorway. She said Richard, and she said it quietly, and then she said she would stop there. Just that. 4 words delivered in the tone of a woman who has navigated 20 years of institutions that were not built with her in mind, and has learned that the most effective thing she can say in a moment like this is the minimum necessary to make the situation absolutely clear. Whitmore looked at her. Something in his expression moved through several things quickly, the reflex toward charm, then a flash of something harder, then the slow arrival of a calculation, the kind that happens when a man finally does the arithmetic on a situation and does not like the result. He did not finish the sentence he had started. Senator Harold Pierce had been standing at the terrace doorway for less than 2 minutes, but 2 minutes had been enough. He had the instincts of a man who has spent 3 decades reading rooms for a living, and what he was reading now told him with complete clarity that there was nothing to be gained by remaining on this terrace and a considerable amount to be lost. He said something brief and indistinct to the aide at his elbow, something that functioned more as a signal than a sentence, and then he turned and moved back through the ballroom with the practiced, unhurried exit of a politician who has decided that distance is the most useful thing he can put between himself and a situation. He would not make a public comment until morning. Frank Donnelly had been standing near the railing since before Reyes had spoken. He was a man who followed rules which had always been his professional identity, and the rules he had followed tonight had seemed straightforward when the evening began. But Donnelly was also a man who understood, in the way that people who spend their careers watching other people understand things, when the frame around a situation has shifted, and the frame had shifted unmistakably and completely in the last 4 minutes. He took 3 steps to his left. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply moved quietly and without explanation, and positioned himself near Malcolm close enough that the proximity was legible to anyone paying attention, which at this point was everyone. He had read the room. Claire Whitmore ended her live stream. She pressed the button, and the red light went off, and she stood in the ballroom holding her phone against her chest and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. The final viewer count was 211,000. She had not intended to document anything consequential tonight. She had intended to show her followers the chandeliers and her father's speech and the particular quality of a room where important things happened, and instead she had recorded something that she understood with a clarity that was arriving too late to be useful, was going to exist in the world for a very long time. The clip had already been saved by 3 separate accounts she did not control. She knew this because 2 of them had already tagged her in their reposts. The next 6 hours moved the way things move when the internet has decided that something matters. By the time the last guests were leaving the gala, the clip had cleared 1 million views. By 3 in the morning, it had passed 2. By 6, when the first morning, news producers were beginning their day and opening their phones and finding the story already assembled and waiting for them, it had reached 4.8 million. NASA's communications office issued a statement at 7:42 in the morning, and the statement was notable for 2 things. The first was that it confirmed Malcolm's role on the mission in terms that were specific enough to be meaningful and carefully worded enough to remain within the boundaries of what was authorized to be disclosed. The second was that it was only the second time in the agency's history that classified program details had been released in a public interest context, the first having occurred during a congressional inquiry in 1986, which the communications director did not mention in the statement, but which 3 separate journalists mentioned in their coverage of it. The statement described Malcolm as the lead architect of the autonomous navigation and survival system for NASA's first long-duration Mars mission. It described the system as mission critical. It used his full name, Dr. Malcolm Hayes, which was the first time that name had appeared in any public NASA document in 3 years. By hour 18, the response from Whitmore's world was arriving in the careful oblique language that money uses when it is putting distance between itself and a problem. 3 of his aerospace investment partners issued statements. None of the statements mentioned Whitmore by name. All of them used phrases like commitment to inclusive excellence and the importance of recognizing contributions at every level, which was a way of saying something without saying it, a language Malcolm had been fluent in for his entire professional life. Whitmore Aerospace Group's market value dropped 4% in pre-market trading on Thursday morning. By the closing bell, it had recovered 1.2 of those 4 points, which the financial press reported as a partial recovery, and which said nothing about what the remaining 2.8% represented in dollars, which was a number with 8 figures. At some point on Thursday afternoon, Claire posted a video. She was sitting in what appeared to be a bedroom natural light. No ring light, which was itself a kind of statement about the register she was attempting. She had clearly been crying recently, and had not tried to conceal it, which was a choice that her followers would later debate at length in terms of its sincerity. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known. She said she never would have, and then she stopped and started again, and said that none of that was the point, that the point was what had happened, and that she was sorry. The video received 12,000 dislikes before she disabled comments. The apology itself became a second viral moment, which was not what she had intended, but was in its own way a kind of accountability that no press release could have engineered. Senator Pierce announced on Friday morning that he was calling for an internal NASA diversity review and the establishment of a working group on recognition practices for mission-critical personnel. He used the phrase "long overdue" 3 times in his prepared statement. His office scheduled a photo opportunity with Malcolm for the following week. Malcolm's team responded that he was unavailable. The response was 3 words. It was not rude. It was not a statement. It did not explain itself or offer an alternative date or express regret for the inconvenience. It was simply the information delivered cleanly, and it landed in the senator's office with the quiet force of something that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. By hour 72, the 2 pending NASA contracts associated with Whitmore Aerospace Group had been placed under a formal conflict of interest review by the agency's Inspector General's office. Whitmore had retained outside counsel by Tuesday evening. The review was expected to take between 60 and 90 days, which meant it would conclude at a time when the news cycle had moved on, but the legal record had not. Isaiah Turner posted nothing for 74 hours. His followers noticed. He was not a large account, not by the standards of the week's conversation, but he had built a small and specific audience around his work. Young black students in STEM people who followed him because he wrote clearly about what it felt like to be building a future inside institutions that had not always been built with you in mind, and his silence during those 74 hours was noticed by the people who followed him closely, the way you notice when someone who always has something to say goes quiet. On hour 74, he posted a photograph. No caption. Just the image taken from a corner of a ballroom, slightly grainy, in the way that phone photographs taken at a distance in low light are grainy, showing a man in a plain dark suit standing alone near the rear wall of a glittering room, hands in his pockets watching a projection screen full of data, while 200 people in evening wear directed their attention toward the lit stage at the front. The man's face was turned slightly away from the camera. You could not fully read his expression, but you could read everything else: the posture, the stillness, the quality of his attention, the particular way a person stands when they are the most important person in a room that does not know it. The photograph reached 2.1 million likes in 48 hours. A magazine editor saw it on Saturday morning and called her photo director. A writer was assigned. The piece would run 6 weeks later with Isaiah's photograph on the cover above a headline that read in large, clean type, "The ones who hold it together." Isaiah did not add a caption to the post until 3 days after it went up, and when he did it was 4 words. "He's why I'm here." Malcolm did not read the coverage. This was not a decision he made dramatically or announced to anyone. It was simply what he did, the same thing he had done every other time the world had generated noise around something he had built, which was to turn back toward the work, because the work was always still there, and it was always more interesting than the noise. He was at his desk at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena by 7:30 on Monday morning, 4 days after the gala, and his desk looked exactly the way it always looked, which was like the desk of a man who thinks faster than he files. Technical printouts layered over each other in a sequence that appeared chaotic, and was not. A coffee that had been hot 40 minutes ago, and was now the temperature of mild regret. His father's silver watch sitting on the corner of the monitor where he always placed it when he sat down close enough to see, without having to reach for it, a habit so old he no longer thought about it consciously. He was working through the next phase of the navigation system, the deep-range extension that would need to function in communication windows 40% narrower than anything the current architecture had been designed for, and it was a genuinely difficult problem, the kind that required the specific quality of attention that only arrives when everything else has been set aside, and he was grateful for it. The way you are grateful for anything that demands your whole mind, because a whole mind is a quiet mind, and quiet was what he needed. He did not hear Dr. Evelyn Brooks come in. He became aware of her the way he sometimes became aware of things in deep focus, not through a specific sensory signal, but through a change in the quality of the room. And he looked up to find her standing inside his office with the door closed behind her. She had closed it quietly, which meant this was not an administrative visit. She looked at him for a moment without saying anything, the way she sometimes did when she was deciding how to begin something she had already decided to say. Then she said he could have corrected Whitmore the moment he touched his shoulder. Malcolm looked at her. He said, "Proof is louder." She held his gaze, and he held hers, and in the silence between those 2 sentences, something settled between them that had been waiting a long time to settle. Not romance that was not what this was, but something that required the same conditions romance requires, which is the willingness to be seen without the armor on. She had watched him endure something that she had not been able to stop, and he had watched her watch him, and they had both been carrying that weight since the night it happened, and now it was in the room between them, and neither of them was going to pretend it wasn't. She said he could have said something. He said he knew. She asked why he hadn't. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had learned the truth only lands when it can't be argued with. That when you correct someone in the moment, they argue, they minimize, they reframe. But when the truth arrives on its own terms, in its own time, fully assembled and undeniable, there is nothing left to argue with. Evelyn nodded once. She looked at the silver watch on the corner of the monitor for a moment, and then she looked back at him, and she said his name, the way his mother sometimes said it, not as a question, and not as a statement, but as something in between an acknowledgement of a person's full weight in the world. Then she opened the door and left, and Malcolm turned back to his screen. He called his mother that evening from the parking lot, sitting in his car with the engine off, because he had not quite been ready to drive yet, which was the way most of his important phone calls with Gloria began, in parking lots, in the in-between spaces of his life, where the transition from one thing to the next required a brief stop. Gloria answered on the second ring. She did not mention the clip. She did not mention the 4.8 million views or the NASA statement or Senator Pierce or Richard Whitmore or any of it. This was so precisely like her that Malcolm felt something loosen in his chest the moment he understood that she was not going to bring it up. She asked if he had eaten today. Malcolm laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and sudden, the kind that arrives before you have had a chance to decide whether the moment calls for one. And it surprised him slightly the way genuine laughter sometimes does when it has been a while. He said he had eaten. She said she did not believe him, but that she was going to let it go. Then she was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register she used when she was about to say something she had been holding for a while. She said his father would have been so tired of being proud of him. Malcolm did not say anything. The sentence landed in the way that the truest sentences land, not with force, but with weight settling into the space it had always been meant to occupy. Tired of being proud, not because the pride had diminished, but because there had been so much of it, so continuously, for so long, that it would have worn a man out, which was the highest thing Gloria Hayes knew how to say about another person's life. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket and took out the silver watch and held it in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the familiar temperature of the metal, the small engraving on the back that he did not need to look at to read because he had long ago memorized every mark on it. He sat in the parking lot until it was dark. In the weeks that followed, the institution moved the way institutions move when they have been caught doing something they cannot defend, which is slowly and with the specific language of systems that are trying to correct, without fully admitting what they are correcting. NASA announced a new internal policy requiring that all mission-critical personnel be introduced by full title and role at any public event where their work was discussed. The policy had a formal designation in the agency's administrative code, a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone outside the building. Inside the building, among the engineers and the systems architects, and the people who had spent years doing work that no one at a gala would ever fully understand, it was called something else. They called it the Hayes Protocol. Not officially. No one had voted on the name. It had simply arrived the way names arrive when they are accurate, and it stayed. The conflict of interest review into Whitmore Aerospace Group's pending NASA contracts concluded 68 days after it had been opened, and its formal recommendation was to freeze both awards pending further structural review. Richard Whitmore was not criminally charged. There was no arrest, no trial, no public reckoning of the dramatic kind. What there was instead was the quiet, permanent severing of his influence over a program he had spent years trying to attach his name to, and the particular kind of consequence that doesn't make headlines but outlasts them, the kind where the doors that used to open now simply do not. The NASA Futures Gala did not occur the following November. In its place, the agency held a working symposium at its Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. No black tie, no donor tables, no podium speeches from people who wrote checks. The attendees were engineers and scientists and mission specialists, and the only people who spoke from the front of the room were the people who had built the things being discussed. It was by every account from the people who attended a better evening. 6 months after the gala, on a Tuesday in late spring, the Mars mission entered its deepest operational phase. The long, uncrewed surface survey that Malcolm's navigation system had been built to support, and the JPL control room was running 24-hour monitoring rotations. Malcolm was on the day shift. He sat at a workstation second from the left, the one with the best sight line to the central telemetry display, and around him the screens showed what they always showed: numbers, scrolling coordinates, updating system indicators, holding steady in green, the quiet and relentless pulse of a machine doing exactly what it had been designed to do in terrain no human foot had ever touched. Commander Daniel Reyes was in the chair beside him. Neither of them spoke much during monitoring rotations. They had learned each other's silences well enough that conversation was no longer necessary for the space between them to feel inhabited. Someone from the night team on their way out set a fresh coffee on the corner of Malcolm's workstation. Malcolm nodded once. His father's silver watch sat on the corner of the monitor, the way it always did, and when the overhead light moved across it at a certain angle, it caught and held the light for a moment a small and private brightness in a room full of screens. Malcolm looked at the numbers. The system was nominal. Everything was exactly as it should be. These are the kinds of true stories that almost never get told, the ones where the person carrying the most weight is also the easiest to overlook, where the proof arrives in its own time and on its own terms, where the recognition when it finally comes is almost beside the point, because the work was always real, whether anyone was watching or not. They are moving stories not because they end with the world transformed, but because they were survived quietly and with dignity by people who decided that the work itself was reason enough to keep going. And somewhere in a corner of a ballroom, a 19-year-old named Isaiah Turner made a decision that night, watching a man stand alone near a rear wall, that he was going to spend his life building things that mattered in rooms that might not know his name, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether anyone was watching. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones that don't make the press release, but deserve to be told, subscribe and stay close, there are more coming.